Daniel Reyes sat across the glass desk, his hands folded tight in his lap, watching Marcus Voss slide a single sheet of paper toward him without even looking up. "Effective today, your position is terminated," Marcus said, his voice flat, as if he were reading out a weather report instead of ending someone's livelihood. Daniel felt his stomach drop. He had walked into this office 30 seconds ago expecting a routine check-in about the new shipping schedule. Instead, he was staring at a termination letter with his name printed at the top, the ink still looking fresh, like it had been prepared before he even sat down. "There must be some mistake," Daniel said, keeping his voice steady even though his pulse was hammering in his ears. "I have been with this company for 6 years. My reviews have always been strong." Marcus finally lifted his eyes from his laptop screen. He was younger than most people expected a CEO to be, with sharp features and an expression that rarely changed, whether he was closing a multi-million-dollar deal or firing a man with a young daughter at home. "Your reviews are not the issue," Marcus said. "Your schedule is. We need people who can be here whenever the company needs them, not people juggling personal complications." The word complications hit Daniel harder than he expected. His personal complication had a name. Her name was Mia, and she was 8 years old, and she had lost her mother 2 years ago to an illness that took her far too soon. Since then, Daniel had done everything he could to be both parent and provider, arranging his shifts around school pickups, doctor visits, and the small, ordinary moments a little girl needed her father present for. "I have never missed a deadline," Daniel said. "I have always found a way to get the work done." "I am aware," Marcus said, closing his laptop with a soft click. "But awareness does not change the decision. This is not personal, Daniel. It is business." Daniel wanted to argue further, but he could see in the young executive's eyes that nothing he said would change the outcome. The decision had already been made somewhere else, in some meeting Daniel was never invited to, by people who saw his life as a line item to be adjusted for efficiency. He picked up the paper with hands that trembled slightly, though he tried hard not to let it show. He would not give Marcus Voss the satisfaction of watching him fall apart. "Is that all?" Daniel asked. "Security will help you collect your things," Marcus said, already turning back to his screen. The matter closed in his mind before Daniel had even stood up from the chair. Daniel walked out of the office in a daze. The hallway outside seemed longer than he remembered, the fluorescent lights overhead buzzing faintly, the sound oddly loud in the silence that had settled over him. Coworkers glanced up from their desks as he passed, some offering sympathetic looks, others quickly turning away, unsure what to say to a man who had just lost his job in front of the entire floor. Karen, from Human Resources, met him near the elevator, with a small cardboard box already prepared, as if his departure had been planned days in advance. She handed it to him gently, her eyes soft with something close to pity. "I am sorry, Daniel," she whispered. "I tried to speak up for you in the meeting, but he had already made up his mind before anyone else had a chance to weigh in." Daniel nodded, unable to find the words to respond. He took the box, feeling the weight of 6 years condensed into a handful of items. A framed photo of Mia, a chipped coffee mug, a stack of old notebooks filled with schedules and notes he no longer had any use for. The elevator ride down felt endless. Daniel stared at his own reflection in the polished metal doors, searching for some sign of the confident, capable man he had been just an hour earlier. All he saw now was someone unsure of what came next. Outside, the afternoon sun felt too bright, too cheerful for a day that had just fallen apart. Daniel stood on the sidewalk for a long moment, the box heavy in his arms, watching people hurry past him, none of them aware that his entire world had just shifted beneath his feet. He thought of Mia, waiting for him to pick her up from school in a few hours, expecting nothing more than her usual snack and a story about her day. How was he supposed to tell her that her father no longer had a job? How was he supposed to explain rent, groceries, and the mounting bills that never seemed to slow down, regardless of circumstance? Daniel took a deep breath and forced himself to walk toward his car. He could not fall apart here, not in public, not where anyone from the office might still be watching. He owed it to Mia to stay strong, even when strength felt impossible to find. The drive to Mia's school passed in a blur. Daniel barely registered the streets he had driven 1,000 times before, his mind circling back again and again to Marcus Voss's cold expression, the casual way he had ended 6 years of dedication as if it meant nothing at all. When Mia climbed into the back seat, her backpack bouncing against her shoulders, her smile immediately lifted something in Daniel's chest, even in the middle of his despair. "Guess what happened today?" Mia said, buckling her seatbelt with the practiced efficiency of a child who had done it 1,000 times. "We got a new fish in the classroom. His name is Bubbles." "That sounds exciting," Daniel said, forcing warmth into his voice, pushing his own troubles aside for her sake. "Tell me everything about Bubbles." As Mia chattered on about her day, Daniel gripped the steering wheel and reminded himself why he had to keep moving forward, no matter how heavy the box in his trunk felt, no matter how uncertain tomorrow had suddenly become. That night, after Mia had gone to bed, Daniel sat alone at the kitchen table, the termination letter spread out before him under the dim light of a single lamp. He opened his laptop and began searching for job listings, his fingers moving quickly across the keyboard, refusing to let despair settle in for even a moment. He thought about calling his sister Lucy, who lived 2 states away, and had always been his steadiest source of support since his wife passed. But it was late, and he did not want to worry her before he had a plan in place. Instead, he made a list. Bills due, savings remaining, jobs to apply for in the morning, small steps, manageable pieces of an otherwise overwhelming problem. Somewhere in the city, in a much larger house with a much larger view, Marcus Voss sat alone in his study, scrolling through quarterly reports, already moving on to the next decision, the next name on a list of adjustments meant to satisfy shareholders who would never know Daniel Reyes existed. Neither man could have imagined that night how their paths would cross again, under circumstances neither of them could have predicted, in a moment that would change everything they thought they understood about each other. Daniel closed his laptop just after midnight, his eyes heavy with exhaustion, his mind still spinning with worry. He walked quietly down the hallway and paused outside Mia's door, listening to the soft, steady sound of her breathing. Whatever happened next, he told himself, he would find a way through it. He always had. He just had no idea how strange and unexpected that way forward would turn out to be. The next morning, Daniel woke before his alarm, his mind already racing through the list he had made the night before. He made Mia breakfast, packed her lunch, and walked her to the bus stop with a smile he did not entirely feel, waving until the yellow bus disappeared around the corner. Then the search began in earnest. Daniel spent hours at the kitchen table, sending out applications to logistics companies, warehouses, and delivery services across the city. Some jobs paid less than half of what he had earned before. Others required hours that would make it impossible to be there for Mia in the mornings and evenings. Still, he applied to everything he could find, refusing to let pride get in the way of survival. By the end of the first week, Daniel had 2 interviews scheduled and a growing pile of rejection emails that he tried not to take personally. He picked up a temporary gig delivering packages for a courier app, driving through the city late into the evening after Mia had gone to bed at her neighbor's apartment, a kind older woman named Ellen who lived down the hall and had offered to help without being asked twice. "You do not have to pay me," Ellen told him one evening, waving off the folded bills he tried to hand her. "Just bring me a coffee sometime, and we will call it even." Daniel appreciated her more than words could express, but the guilt of relying on someone else's generosity gnawed at him constantly. He was used to being the one who helped others, not the one asking for favors just to make ends meet. The days blurred together in a routine of applications, interviews that led nowhere, and long nights behind the wheel of his car, delivering packages to strangers who barely glanced up from their phones to say thank you. His savings, modest to begin with, dwindled faster than he had anticipated. Rent was due in 2 weeks, and Daniel found himself doing mental math late at night, trying to figure out which bills could wait and which could not. Despite everything, he never let Mia see the strain. He still made time for her homework, still read her a chapter of her favorite book before bed, still asked about Bubbles the classroom fish with genuine interest, even when his own mind was consumed with worry about the future. One evening, as Daniel tucked Mia into bed, she looked up at him with the kind of directness only children seem capable of. "Daddy, are you sad about something?" she asked. "You have been quiet a lot lately." Daniel's chest tightened, but he kept his expression calm. I have just been thinking about grown-up things, he said gently. Nothing for you to worry about. I promise, everything is going to be fine. Mia studied his face for a long moment, the way she sometimes did when she was deciding whether to believe him, then nodded and closed her eyes, trusting him the way she always had. Daniel sat by her bed a while longer, listening to her breathing slow into sleep, before quietly returning to the kitchen table and the laptop that had become both his lifeline and his source of constant frustration. Meanwhile, across the city, Marcus Voss was facing pressures of his own, though of an entirely different kind. The quarterly numbers at Kestrel Holdings had come in lower than the board had hoped, despite the recent round of workforce reductions Marcus had championed as necessary and efficient. The market wants to see aggressive growth, said Nathan, one of the senior board members, during a tense meeting that stretched late into the afternoon. Cutting costs is not enough anymore. We need results, Marcus, and we need them soon. Marcus nodded along, absorbing the pressure the way he always did, internalizing it as fuel to push harder, demand more, tolerate less. He had built his reputation on being the man who made the difficult decisions others were too soft to make. It had gotten him this position at a young age, and he intended to keep climbing, whatever the cost. That evening, his assistant, Grace, knocked softly on his office door, just as he was preparing to leave. "Sir, your sister called again," Grace said. "She has left 3 messages this week. She says it is important." Marcus barely looked up from his screen. "Tell her I will call when I have time." Grace hesitated at the doorway, clearly wanting to say more, but she knew better than to push. She had worked for Marcus long enough to understand that his family had learned to expect very little of his attention these days, ever since the company had consumed nearly every hour of his life. Marcus's sister, Helen, had been trying to reach him about their aging mother, whose health had been declining steadily over the past year. Marcus told himself he would call soon, that once the current quarter settled down, he would make time. He had been telling himself the same thing for months. That night, Marcus worked later than usual, poring over spreadsheets and growth projections long after the office had emptied out. When he finally left, the rain had already begun, light at first, then steadily growing heavier, as he pulled out of the parking garage and onto the wet, glistening streets. He was tired, in a way that went beyond physical exhaustion, though he would never have admitted it, not even to himself. His mind churned with numbers, deadlines, and the constant gnawing pressure to prove himself worthy of the position he had fought so hard to reach. The radio played quietly as he drove, the wipers sweeping steadily across the windshield, the headlights of oncoming cars blurring into long streaks of light against the darkened glass. Marcus barely noticed the roads narrowing as he left the city behind, his thoughts still tangled in the day's frustrations. Back in his apartment, Daniel had just finished another long shift behind the wheel of his delivery car. His shoulders ached, his eyes felt heavy, and the numbers in his banking app offered little comfort. Still, he reminded himself that things were moving, slowly but surely. He had a second interview scheduled for the following week, at a mid-sized shipping firm across town, a position that would allow him more flexibility than his previous job ever had. He picked up Mia from Ellen's apartment, thanked her warmly, and carried his sleepy daughter home, her small arms wrapped loosely around his neck as he climbed the stairs. He laid her gently in her bed, kissed her forehead, and allowed himself a rare, quiet moment of hope. Perhaps things were finally beginning to turn around. After making sure Mia was settled, Daniel decided to take one more delivery run before calling it a night, hoping the extra earnings would help cover an unexpected car repair bill that had appeared that week. He kissed his sleeping daughter's forehead once more, left a note for Ellen in case Mia woke early, and headed back out into the rain-soaked streets. The roads outside the city were quieter at this hour, the rain falling steadily, drumming softly against his windshield as he drove toward the address on his delivery app. Daniel kept both hands firmly on the wheel, his headlights cutting through the darkness, illuminating the slick asphalt ahead. He had driven this stretch of road countless times before, a long curving path that ran alongside a wooded area before merging back into the main highway. Tonight, however, something about the road felt different. The rain heavier than the forecast had predicted, visibility dropping with every passing mile. Daniel slowed his speed instinctively, a habit built from years of careful driving, always mindful of Mia waiting for him at home. He glanced at the clock on his dashboard, calculating how much longer this final delivery would take before he could finally rest. Ahead of him, in the distance, he noticed a set of headlights swerving unnaturally, cutting sharply toward the guardrail before disappearing suddenly from view. Daniel's heart lurched in his chest as he eased his foot toward the brake, straining to see through the rain-streaked windshield. Something was very wrong up ahead, and every instinct in Daniel's body told him to slow down and pay close attention. He had no way of knowing yet just how much that instinct was about to matter, not only for the stranger in the car ahead of him, but for the entire course of his own life from this night forward. Daniel's hands tightened around the steering wheel as he approached the bend in the road, his mind already shifting from exhaustion to alertness, sensing that something significant was unfolding just beyond the curtain of rain in front of him. As Daniel rounded the bend, his headlights swept across a scene that made his breath catch in his throat. A car had gone off the road entirely, tipped onto its side against a shallow ditch just past the guardrail, one wheel still spinning slowly in the rain-soaked air. Thin trails of smoke curled up from beneath the hood, faintly visible in the glow of his own headlights. Daniel pulled over immediately, his heart pounding as he threw the car into park and grabbed his phone from the passenger seat. His hands moved quickly, dialing for emergency help even as he stepped out into the rain, the cold water soaking through his jacket within seconds. "There has been an accident," Daniel said into the phone, his voice steady, despite the adrenaline surging through him. "A car has gone off the road. I can see smoke coming from the engine. I need an ambulance and the fire department right away." The operator asked for his location, and Daniel gave the nearest mile marker he could remember, his eyes fixed on the wrecked vehicle the entire time. She told him help was on the way and encouraged him to stay at a safe distance until they arrived. But as Daniel watched, the thin trail of smoke thickened, and a faint orange glow began to flicker near the front of the car. He could see a shape slumped against the driver's side window, unmoving, and every instinct in his body told him there was no time to simply wait. "Sir, are you still there?" the operator asked. "There is someone still inside," Daniel said, already moving toward the ditch. "I have to check on them." He set the phone down on the hood of his own car, the operator's voice still calling out instructions he could no longer clearly hear over the sound of the rain and his own racing heartbeat. He climbed carefully down the muddy slope toward the tilted vehicle, his shoes slipping slightly against the wet grass. Up close, Daniel could see the driver clearly now, a man slumped forward against the steering wheel, his forehead resting near the airbag that had deployed, a thin line of blood visible along his temple. The window on the driver's side had cracked but not shattered, and the door, twisted from the impact, would not budge no matter how hard Daniel pulled at the handle. The orange glow near the engine grew brighter, and a fresh curl of dark smoke rose into the rain, mixing strangely with the falling water. Daniel's mind raced, weighing the seconds he had left before the situation grew far more dangerous. He looked around quickly and spotted a large rock partially buried in the mud a few feet away. He grabbed it, hurried back to the car, and struck the cracked window with as much force as he could manage. It took 2 attempts before the glass gave way, crumbling inward in small, dull fragments. "Hey, can you hear me?" Daniel called out, reaching carefully through the broken window to unfasten the man's seatbelt. "I need you to wake up. We have to get you out of here." The man stirred faintly, a low groan escaping his lips, but he did not fully regain consciousness. Daniel worked quickly, his fingers finding the seatbelt release and easing the man's weight forward, careful not to cause further injury, as he maneuvered him toward the broken window. The smoke was growing thicker now, stinging Daniel's eyes, and the orange glow beneath the hood had begun to spread visibly along the edges of the engine compartment. Daniel knew he had only moments left before the situation became far more dangerous than it already was. With a final, determined effort, Daniel pulled the man through the window, guiding his weight carefully as they both stumbled backward onto the wet grass, putting distance between themselves and the car. He half-carried, half-dragged the stranger further up the slope, his muscles straining, his breath ragged from exertion and adrenaline. Just as they reached solid ground several yards away, a sudden burst of flame erupted from beneath the hood of the wrecked car, casting flickering orange light across the rain-slick road. The heat rolled outward in a wave, and Daniel instinctively shielded the unconscious man with his own body, turning his face away from the sudden brightness. For a long moment, Daniel simply knelt there in the mud and the rain, his chest heaving, his hands trembling from the exertion and the shock of what had just happened. The man beside him stirred again, his eyes fluttering open slowly, disoriented and confused. "You are going to be okay," Daniel said, keeping his voice calm and steady, the way he might speak to Mia after a bad dream. "Help is on the way. Just try to stay still." The man blinked up at him, clearly struggling to focus, rain mixing with the blood along his temple. "What happened?" he murmured weakly. "Your car went off the road," Daniel said. "You are safe now. Just breathe." In the distance, the sound of sirens began to grow louder, cutting through the steady rhythm of the rain. Daniel felt a wave of relief wash over him, though his hands were still shaking from everything that had just unfolded in the span of only a few frantic minutes. As the flashing lights of an ambulance and a fire truck finally rounded the bend, illuminating the scene in bursts of red and white, Daniel finally allowed himself a moment to truly look at the man he had just pulled from the burning wreckage. Something about the face seemed familiar, though in the chaos and dim light, Daniel could not immediately place it. It was only when the paramedics arrived and began attending to the injured man, angling their flashlight briefly across his features, that recognition struck Daniel like a physical blow. It was Marcus Voss, the same man who, only weeks earlier, had looked him in the eye and dismissed 6 years of his life without a flicker of hesitation. Daniel stood frozen for a moment, rain still falling steadily around him, his mind struggling to reconcile the helpless, injured man on the stretcher with the cold, composed executive he remembered from that office. There was no arrogance left in Marcus now, no carefully controlled expression, just a vulnerable stranger, grateful to be alive, with no idea whose hands had just saved him. A paramedic named Oliver approached Daniel, gently checking him for injuries and asking a series of routine questions about what had happened. Daniel answered calmly, describing the crash, the smoke, the moment he had pulled the man free just before the flames erupted. "You did the right thing tonight," Oliver said, offering Daniel a thick blanket to wrap around his shoulders against the cold rain. Another minute or two, and this could have ended very differently. Daniel nodded, still watching as the paramedics carefully loaded Marcus onto a stretcher and prepared to transport him to the hospital. Marcus, still dazed and struggling to stay conscious, turned his head slightly, his eyes searching for the person who had pulled him from the wreck. "Wait," Marcus mumbled weakly, reaching a hand out toward Daniel. "Who are you? I need to know who you are." Daniel hesitated, caught between the instinct to offer comfort to an injured man and the memory of that cold office where he had been discarded without a second thought. In the end, his conscience won out, though he chose not to reveal his identity just yet. "Just someone who happened to be driving by," Daniel said quietly. "Focus on getting better. That is all that matters right now." The paramedics lifted the stretcher and carried Marcus toward the waiting ambulance, the sirens preparing to carry him swiftly toward the hospital. Daniel watched the vehicle pull away, its red lights fading into the rain-soaked darkness, before turning back toward his own car, still parked along the shoulder of the road. A police officer took his statement briefly, jotting down notes about the accident and Daniel's actions, thanking him for his quick thinking before allowing him to leave the scene. Daniel gave his name and basic details, though he made no mention of his previous connection to the man he had just saved. Driving home through the last of the rain, Daniel's hands still trembled slightly on the steering wheel, adrenaline slowly giving way to disbelief. Of all the people in the city, of all the cars that could have gone off that particular road on that particular night, fate had placed Marcus Voss directly in his path. He thought about waking Mia to tell her what had happened, then decided against it, not wanting to frighten her with the details of the crash or the flames he had narrowly avoided. Instead, he quietly changed out of his soaked clothes, checked on his sleeping daughter, and sat alone in the darkness of his living room, trying to process the strange turn the night had taken. He had saved the life of the very man who had ended his career without hesitation, without compassion, without a second thought for the family depending on him. And yet, faced with another human being trapped and in danger, Daniel had not paused for even a moment to consider who was inside that car. It was simply the right thing to do. It always would have been, regardless of who was behind the wheel. Still, as Daniel finally settled into bed that night, exhaustion pulling at every muscle in his body, he could not shake the strange, unsettled feeling that this chance encounter was far from over. Somewhere across the city, in a hospital room bathed in soft fluorescent light, Marcus Voss lay awake as well, staring at the ceiling, replaying the same unanswered question over and over in his mind. Who was the stranger who had saved his life, and why had he refused to give his name? Neither man could have predicted, as the rain finally slowed to a gentle drizzle outside their separate windows, just how deeply their next meeting would change the course of both their lives. Marcus Voss opened his eyes to the steady beep of a heart monitor and the harsh brightness of hospital lights overhead. His head throbbed with a dull, persistent ache, and it took him a long moment to piece together where he was and how he had gotten there. A nurse noticed him stirring and stepped closer, checking the monitor beside his bed. "You are at Riverside Memorial," she said gently. "You were in a car accident last night. You are lucky to be alive." The word lucky settled uneasily in Marcus's mind. He remembered the rain, the sudden loss of control on the slick road, the terrifying sensation of the car flipping, and then very little else beyond fragmented images of flames and a stranger's voice telling him to stay calm. "There was someone there," Marcus said, his voice hoarse. "Someone pulled me out before the car caught fire. Do you know who that was?" The nurse shook her head. "The paramedics mentioned a man who called it in and stayed until help arrived, but he left before anyone could get his full information. He gave a statement to the police, though." Marcus spent the rest of the morning drifting in and out of uneasy rest, his mind circling back again and again to the same unanswered question. He had built his entire career on control, on always knowing exactly what was happening and why, and the idea that a complete stranger had saved his life and vanished without explanation gnawed at him relentlessly. By the afternoon, Grace arrived at the hospital, her expression a careful mixture of relief and concern as she stepped into his room. "The board has been asking about you constantly," she said, setting down a folder of documents on the small table beside his bed. "I told them you would reach out once you were feeling better." "Forget the board for a moment," Marcus said, surprising even himself with the urgency in his voice. "I need you to find out who pulled me out of that car. There has to be a police report, a name, something." Grace blinked, clearly taken aback by the request. In all her years working for Marcus, she had never once seen him prioritize a personal matter over company business, not even for a moment. "I will look into it," she said carefully. "Is everything all right, sir?" Marcus stared at the ceiling for a long moment before answering. "I nearly died last night, Grace. A stranger risked his own safety to save mine, and I do not even know his name. That does not sit right with me." Grace nodded and left to make a few calls, while Marcus remained alone with his thoughts, the sterile silence of the hospital room pressing in around him. For the first time in longer than he could remember, the numbers and projections that usually consumed his every waking thought felt distant and unimportant. Later that evening, Grace returned with a folder containing a copy of the police report from the accident. She handed it to Marcus without a word, watching his expression carefully as he scanned the details. The name on the report was Daniel Reyes. Marcus felt the air leave his lungs as recognition slammed into him with sudden, overwhelming force. He knew that name. He had signed off on that name's termination just weeks earlier, without hesitation, without a second thought, treating an entire family's livelihood as nothing more than an entry on a cost reduction spreadsheet. "This cannot be right," Marcus murmured, reading the name again as though it might change if he looked closely enough. "Is something wrong?" Grace asked. Marcus set the folder down slowly, his mind reeling. "I fired this man, weeks ago. He had been with the company for years, and I let him go without even considering the impact it might have on his life." Grace remained quiet, sensing that Marcus needed a moment to process what he had just discovered. She had been present in the meeting where Daniel's termination had been discussed, and remembered Karen from Human Resources raising concerns that had ultimately been dismissed. "And now that same man saved my life," Marcus continued, almost to himself, "without knowing I was the person he was pulling from that car. Or perhaps he did know, and he still chose to help me anyway." The realization sat heavily on Marcus's chest, heavier somehow than the injuries he had sustained in the crash itself. He thought back to the cold, detached way he had delivered the news of Daniel's termination, the casual dismissal of a man's genuine concerns about supporting his daughter. Marcus spent the following days recovering at home, his physical injuries healing steadily, but his mind remained fixed on the unsettling truth he had uncovered. He found himself replaying the termination meeting over and over, remembering details he had barely registered at the time, the flicker of desperation in Daniel's eyes, the mention of a daughter who depended on him entirely. He thought about his own sister, Helen, and the unanswered calls he had ignored for weeks in favor of quarterly reports and shareholder meetings. He thought about his mother, whose declining health he had pushed to the back of his mind, telling himself there would always be time later. For the first time in years, Marcus began to question whether the ambition that had driven him so relentlessly forward had cost him something far more valuable than he had ever allowed himself to consider. One morning, nearly a week after the accident, Marcus asked Grace to arrange a meeting, though not the kind she was accustomed to organizing. He wanted an address, not a boardroom. "Are you certain about this?" Grace asked, sensing the significance of the request. "You could simply send a formal letter, or have someone from Human Resources handle the matter." "No," Marcus said firmly. "This needs to come from me directly." Grace located Daniel's address through the Human Resources file still on record, and provided it without further argument, though her expression remained curious about what exactly Marcus intended to do. That afternoon, Marcus drove himself to a modest apartment complex on the edge of the city, a part of town he rarely had reason to visit. He sat in his car for several long minutes outside the building, gathering the courage to face a conversation he knew would not be easy, regardless of how it unfolded. When Daniel opened the door and found Marcus Voss standing on his doorstep, his expression shifted rapidly through surprise, confusion, and finally a guarded wariness that Marcus could hardly blame him for. "I did not expect to see you here," Daniel said, his voice careful and measured. "I know," Marcus replied. "I would not have expected it either, until a few days ago." There was a long, uncomfortable pause between them, the weight of everything unspoken hanging heavily in the air. Behind Daniel, faint sounds drifted from inside the apartment, a child's voice humming quietly, unaware of the tension unfolding at the front door. "I read the police report," Marcus said finally. "I know it was you who pulled me out of that car. I do not understand why you did not tell me who you were, especially after everything that happened between us." Daniel folded his arms, his expression unreadable. "It did not seem important at the time. You needed help. That is all that mattered in that moment." Marcus nodded slowly, feeling the full weight of shame settle over him as he stood there, facing the man he had dismissed so easily weeks earlier. "I owe you an apology, Daniel. Not just for the accident, but for how I treated you when I let you go. I did not consider what that decision would mean for you and your daughter. I was focused entirely on numbers, and I lost sight of the fact that those numbers represented real people with real lives." Daniel studied Marcus carefully, searching his face for any hint of insincerity, but found none. The man standing before him seemed genuinely different from the cold executive who had ended his career without hesitation. "I appreciate you saying that," Daniel said eventually. "But an apology does not change what my family has been through these past few weeks." "I understand," Marcus said. "I am not here just to apologize, though I do mean it sincerely. I want to make things right, if you will allow me the chance." Daniel remained quiet for a long moment, weighing the sincerity of the offer against the very real struggles his family had endured since that difficult day in Marcus's office. Finally, he stepped back from the doorway, gesturing for Marcus to come inside. "Would you like to come in?" Daniel asked. "I think we have quite a bit to discuss." Marcus nodded gratefully, stepping into the modest apartment, immediately struck by the warmth of the space, despite its simplicity. Crayon drawings covered part of the refrigerator. A small pair of children's shoes sat neatly by the door, and the quiet hum of a cartoon played softly from another room. As the two men sat down at the kitchen table, an unlikely conversation began to unfold, one that would slowly bridge the vast distance between the cold decisions of a boardroom and the very real consequences those decisions carried for the people living far beyond its walls. Neither man could have predicted, as that conversation stretched late into the evening, just how significantly it would reshape not only their own lives, but the lives of everyone connected to Kestrel Holdings in the months that followed. In the weeks that followed their conversation, Marcus Voss began making changes that surprised nearly everyone at Kestrel Holdings, starting with Daniel Reyes himself. Rather than simply offering Daniel his old position back, Marcus proposed something far more significant: a senior coordinator role with a flexible schedule designed specifically to support working parents, along with a salary that reflected the value of Daniel's years of dedicated service. "I do not want this to feel like charity," Marcus explained during their meeting at the office, the same glass desk between them, though the atmosphere between the two men had shifted entirely from their previous encounter. "You are qualified for this position on merit alone. The flexibility is simply something that should have been available to you from the beginning." Daniel accepted the offer, though not without a lingering sense of caution. Trust, once broken, did not rebuild itself overnight, and Daniel made it clear that he intended to judge Marcus by his actions moving forward, not simply his words. "I appreciate the offer," Daniel said, "but I need you to understand that I am not just doing this for myself. If I come back, I want to know that other employees in similar situations will not face what I went through." Marcus nodded firmly. "That is exactly what I intend to address next." True to his word, Marcus began working with Karen from Human Resources to overhaul the company's approach to employees balancing caregiving responsibilities with their professional obligations. New policies were introduced allowing flexible scheduling, remote work options where possible, and clearer channels for employees to raise concerns without fear of losing their positions over circumstances beyond their control. The changes did not come without resistance. Some members of the board, including Nathan, questioned whether such policies would hurt productivity or send the wrong message to shareholders focused purely on efficiency and growth. "Our people are not simply resources to be optimized," Marcus said firmly during a tense board meeting, echoing sentiments he would have dismissed outright only weeks earlier. "A company that takes care of its employees builds loyalty, and loyalty translates into long-term stability, far more reliably than short-term cost-cutting ever will." Slowly, the resistance began to soften, particularly as early results showed improved morale and reduced turnover among staff members who had previously felt undervalued and overlooked. Word spread throughout the company that something had genuinely shifted at the top, that the cold, detached leadership style Marcus had once been known for was giving way to something more thoughtful and considerate. Beyond the walls of Kestrel Holdings, Marcus's personal life began to shift as well. He finally returned his sister Helen's calls, arranging a visit to see their mother, whose health had continued to decline while he had been consumed by professional obligations. The visit was overdue, and Marcus arrived carrying a quiet, humbled understanding of everything he had allowed to slip away in pursuit of career success. "I am sorry it took so long," Marcus told Helen as they sat together in their mother's kitchen, the warmth of the space filling him with an emotion he had not allowed himself to feel in years. "I let work consume everything. I am going to do better." Helen studied her brother carefully, noting the sincerity in his voice, an openness she had not seen from him in a very long time. "I am glad to hear that," she said. "Mom will be glad too. She has missed you." Meanwhile, Daniel settled comfortably into his new role at Kestrel Holdings, his schedule allowing him to be present for Mia's school events, doctor appointments, and the small, everyday moments that mattered most to him as a father. His co-workers welcomed him back warmly, many of them having heard whispered versions of the remarkable story involving their CEO and the very man he had once let go. An unexpected friendship began to form between Daniel and Marcus over the following months, built gradually through shared conversations during work hours, and later, through small gestures of genuine kindness that extended beyond the office. Marcus occasionally stopped by Daniel's apartment with small gifts for Mia, books or puzzles that quickly earned him her enthusiastic approval. "You are the man from the fire," Mia said one afternoon, studying Marcus with the frank curiosity only children seem to possess. "Daddy saved you. That makes you kind of like family now." Marcus smiled, an expression that came far more easily to him these days than it once had. "I suppose it does," he said. "Your father is a remarkable man, Mia. I am very lucky he was there that night." Daniel, standing nearby, allowed himself a small, genuine smile as he watched the interaction unfold, a quiet sense of peace settling over him that he had not felt in a very long time. Several months later, Kestrel Holdings hosted a company-wide event celebrating the successful rollout of its new employee support policies, along with impressive improvements in staff retention and overall workplace satisfaction. Marcus stood before the gathered employees, Daniel seated among the crowd, and delivered remarks that surprised many in attendance with their honesty and vulnerability. "Not long ago, I made a decision that I deeply regret," Marcus said, his voice steady despite the personal nature of his words. "I let go of a dedicated employee because I viewed his personal responsibilities as an inconvenience rather than a reflection of his character. That same man later saved my life without hesitation, without knowing whether I deserved that kindness." The room fell silent, employees listening intently as Marcus continued, his gaze finding Daniel briefly among the crowd. "Daniel Reyes taught me something I should have understood long before that night on the road. Leadership is not about how efficiently we can cut costs or streamline operations. It is about recognizing the humanity in the people we work alongside every single day. I am grateful for the lesson, even though it came at a cost I deeply regret causing." Applause filled the room, warm and genuine, as Daniel rose briefly to acknowledge the recognition, though he remained characteristically humble about the entire situation. Later that evening, as the event wound down, Marcus approached Daniel privately, extending a hand that Daniel shook firmly. "Thank you," Marcus said simply, "for more than just that night on the road, for giving me the chance to become someone better." Daniel nodded, a quiet warmth in his expression. "We all deserve second chances, Marcus. I am glad you took yours seriously." As the two men parted ways that evening, walking out into the cool evening air toward their separate cars, neither could have predicted, months earlier, how profoundly their lives would become intertwined. A single decision made in a moment of cold indifference had nearly ended in tragedy, yet had ultimately given rise to a friendship built on honesty, humility, and the shared understanding that true success was measured not in profits or efficiency, but in the way people treated one another when it mattered most. Daniel drove home that night with a lightness in his chest that had been absent for far too long, eager to return to Mia and share the quiet satisfaction of a day that had closed an unexpected chapter of his life on a note of genuine hope. Marcus, meanwhile, drove toward his mother's house instead of his usual empty apartment, looking forward, for the first time in years, to an evening spent simply being present with the people who mattered most. Both men had been forever changed by a single rainy night on a quiet stretch of road, a night that had begun in fear and ended in an unexpected bond neither of them would ever take for granted again.